8 ships appeared from nowhere. Nobody knows who sent them. On the same day, across the galaxy, 8 enormous pyramid-shaped vessels descended from the skies of 8 separate worlds. No communication, no explanation, just something ancient and intentional settling into 8 different atmospheres simultaneously and waiting. That was how the entire history of the Old Republic began. And here is what you need to understand before this story unfolds. What followed those 8 ships lasted over 25,000 years. 25,000 years of war and civilization and catastrophe. The Jedi Order was born from it. The Sith tradition was forged within it. Darth Revan walked its corridors. An emperor who could not die built his empire in its shadows for 1,000 years before anyone in the galaxy knew he existed. And when it all finally ended, it ended not with a battle but with a betrayal so patient and so carefully constructed that it took 1,000 years to execute. This is the story of the Old Republic. All of it. From the first Force users on a world called Tython to the last Sith Lord counting down to his perfect moment. Every war, every fall, every choice that changed the shape of the galaxy forever. Keep listening, because none of it ends the way you think it will. Nobody knew where the 8 enormous pyramid-shaped ships came from. Nobody knew who had built them or why they appeared above 8 separate worlds on what seemed to be a single coordinated day in galactic history. They descended from the sky without announcement, without communication, moving with a precision that no known technology could explain. And on each world they visited, they did exactly the same thing. They settled, they opened, and they waited. On Ando Prime, the monks who called themselves the Dabendu were the first to board without hesitation. They had been developing their understanding of what they named the Ashla, the living energy flowing through all things, for generations. When the ship appeared above their world, they recognized it the way you recognize something you have been expecting without knowing you were expecting it. An invitation that had always been coming, finally arriving. On other worlds, the Thoyor were more patient. They hovered at the edges of atmospheres for days, sometimes for weeks, radiating a calm so complete that even the most cautious of those they were waiting for eventually found themselves walking toward the entrance and stepping inside. Force-sensitive beings from different cultures, different languages, different traditions and histories, and ways of understanding the world, were lifted off their home planets and brought together in these ancient vessels that seemed to breathe with a consciousness older than anything the pilgrims had encountered. They could not speak to each other at first. They shared no language and no common history, and no frame of reference for making sense of each other's lives. But they shared the thing that had always defined them in isolation, and were now sharing in company for the first time. That quiet awareness of the energy connecting all living things. And in the enclosed space of the Thoyor, surrounded by others who felt exactly what they had always felt alone, that awareness became something larger than any of them had managed to develop on their own. When all 8 ships had gathered their pilgrims, they converged on a single destination, a world called Tython. Tython was remarkable before anyone set foot on it. Its geography seemed designed to teach the lesson its new inhabitants would spend the next 10,000 years learning and relearning. Above its surface hung 2 moons in a counterbalance, so precise it appeared intentional rather than astronomical. The first moon, Ashla, was pale and serene. Its light was cool and steady, the kind of light that makes darkness feel less absolute, that calls the mind toward peace and clarity and the patient work of understanding. The second moon, Bogan, was darker and heavier in the sky. Its pull felt in the tides and in something deeper, something that the force-sensitive among the pilgrims could feel pressing at the edges of their awareness. Not maliciously, with weight, with the reminder that existence contained aspects that serenity alone could not hold, light and shadow, peace and strength. Two aspects of the same cosmic truth, written in the sky above the world where the Jedi Order would be born. The pilgrims who descended from the Toyor called themselves the Jedi. That second letter was not an accident. It was a philosophy. The Jedi believed in balance above all things. They did not see light and dark as enemies of each other. They understood passion as something real and valid, and serenity as something equally real and valid, and the deliberate maintenance of balance between them as the goal toward which genuine wisdom reached. They built their civilization on that idea, using the Thoyor as their foundations. They raised 8 temple cities from Tython's surface. At the heart of their world stood the Temple of Balance at Akar-Kesh, not merely a building but a declaration of principle carved in stone, announcing to every generation that looked upon it what the Jedi believed and why that belief mattered. For more than 10,000 years, this worked. The Jedi developed techniques for engaging with the Force in its full complexity at a level of sophistication that would astonish later generations. Their meditation practices could dissolve conflicts that armies couldn't resolve. Their healing arts mended wounds that had no business mending. They could feel the intentions of beings they had never met, sense the shape of events before those events had fully formed, and perceive the living world around them with a depth and clarity that made ordinary perception seem like looking at the galaxy through a narrow window. They were scholars and philosophers and healers and peacekeepers all at once, and the civilization they built on Tython was unlike anything the galaxy had produced before or would produce in quite the same way again. When someone drifted too far toward anger and the pull of the darker teachings, they were sent to Ashla's temples to learn the discipline of stillness. When someone retreated too deeply into passivity and detachment, the lessons of Bogan reminded them that strength had its necessary place and that refusing to feel was not the same as wisdom. It was a civilization of constant, deliberate self-correction, built on the humble acknowledgement that balance was not a state achieved once and maintained effortlessly. It was a practice, something you returned to consciously every single day. What it was not built for was war. The Rakata had been moving through the galaxy for tens of thousands of years before the Jedi Order existed. They were an aquatic-featured species who had made a discovery that the Jedi would have found horrifying. The Rakata had learned to power their technology through the dark side of the Force, not through balance or wisdom or any attempt at understanding the invisible energy connecting all things, but through channeled hatred and fear and the suffering of other living beings. Their ships drew on it. Their weapons amplified it. Their entire civilization was built on the principle that domination was the natural order of things, and the dark side of the Force was simply the universe confirming that principle. The infinite empire had consumed thousands of worlds. Entire species had been reduced to slavery, their cultures dismantled and their histories erased in service of a civilization that valued them only as labor. The Rakata's force-powered technology gave them advantages that made organized resistance seem essentially impossible. And they had spent millennia perfecting the machinery of total control. They employed creatures called force hounds, beings trained specifically to hunt force-sensitive populations, to seek out worlds where the invisible energy ran strong and where populations with force potential might prove either useful or threatening to the Empire's continued expansion. One of these hunters eventually followed a signal in the Force, so powerful it was like navigating toward a star. Tython was one of the strongest Force nexuses in the galaxy, and its presence was impossible for a trained hunter to ignore. When the scout found it and reported back, the Rakata sent warships. The Jedi had never needed to fight. Their entire tradition had been built around avoiding conflict and resolving it through wisdom when it arose anyway. Now they faced an enemy whose ships fired beams of dark side energy and whose soldiers had been conditioned from birth to feel nothing toward those they killed except contempt. The peaceful scholars of Tython found themselves fighting for survival for the first time in 10,000 years. And the experience of fighting began doing something to them that even victory could not undo. Tython itself responded to their need. The planet that had been chosen as the birthplace of this tradition was not simply a passive landscape. When its people reached out in something very close to prayer, something answered. The ancient Tow-Yor vessels, which had been resting as the foundations of Tython cities for 10 millennia, stirred from their long dormancy. Hidden capabilities that had never been needed in 10,000 years of peace revealed themselves all at once. The ships fired concentrated beams of force energy that tore through Rakata warships with a speed and precision that shocked the invaders. The attack was repelled. The Jedi survived. But survival changed them in ways none of them fully understood until the change had already happened. Some among the Jedi discovered in the heat of combat what was available through heightened emotion, through the willingness to draw on anger and determination, and the desperate love of what they were protecting. The Force, channeled through the urgency of battle rather than the stillness of meditation, offered things that pure serenity had never produced. Others recoiled from exactly that discovery, becoming more committed than ever to the Ashla path, more certain than ever that nothing good came from allowing darkness into the light, even when that darkness was wielded in service of protection. The experience of war had revealed a tension that had always existed within the Jedi philosophy, but had never before been tested in this way. And once revealed, it could not be unseen. The breaking point came not from a second Rakata assault, but from political conflict within the Tython system itself. A ruler on a neighboring world launched a military campaign to control the entire system. The Jedi mobilized. They won. And what emerged from that experience was a community that had learned something about itself. It could not unlearn. Some of them were extraordinarily good at war. The Force, channeled through a warrior's conviction rather than a scholar's balance, made them into things the philosophical tradition of 10,000 years had not anticipated or prepared for. The leaders who emerged became voices for a division that had been waiting for exactly this crisis to make itself real. Those who believed the Jedi needed to accept the power available through passion and emotion argued that strength in service of protecting the innocent was not only permissible but necessary. Those who had watched what that argument looked like up close argued with equal conviction that it led nowhere a person of conscience could follow. Both sides were defending something real. Both sides were missing something equally real about what the other understood. And because neither could see what the other saw, they stopped talking, and they started fighting. The Force Wars lasted a decade. Former allies turned knowledge built through years of shared practice and mutual trust into weapons. Masters who had spent years learning to understand each other applied that understanding to predicting each other's movements in combat. Temples that had stood for 10,000 years burned. Knowledge accumulated over countless generations burned with them. Families fractured. Communities were destroyed. Students turned on teachers. The careful balance that had sustained Tython through everything the galaxy had thrown at it collapsed completely as the people tasked with embodying that balance chose their sides and refused to look back. And then the world itself broke. The final confrontation between the two factions triggered something no one had predicted and no one could stop. Tython's force nexuses, saturated by years of the Jedi tearing at each other across the planet's surface, released their accumulated energy all at once. The storm that swept through everything in its path was not natural. It was the planet itself responding to what had been done to it. Later, historians would call it the Force Cataclysm. The world that had been chosen as the birthplace of a great tradition was left in ruins. What had once been the most sophisticated force-using civilization in galactic history became a monument to what happens when the pursuit of balance collapses into the violence of absolute certainty. The survivors were mostly those who had followed the Ashla path. They looked at what Tython had become and understood they could not return to what they had been. The balance they had tried to maintain had proven impossible to sustain when pushed to its ultimate test. When it mattered most, they had been forced to choose. The choosing had cost them everything. In the aftermath, the survivors made a decision that would echo through the next 25,000 years of galactic history. They would abandon the Jedi way entirely. No more attempts to walk between light and dark. No more treating both aspects of the Force as equal expressions of the same cosmic truth. They would dedicate themselves to the light side and guard against the dark side as a corruption to be resisted with everything they possessed. They had seen what the darkness did to those it touched. They would not see it again. They dropped the second letter from their name. No longer Jedi. Simply Jedi. This was not a small change. It was the rejection of a philosophical tradition that had sustained a civilization for 10,000 years. Where the Jedi had seen light and dark as twin aspects of a single truth, the Jedi would understand the dark side as seduction, as the promise of power made to those who had not yet fully grasped what that power cost. The Force had two sides, but only one of them led anywhere a person of conscience could go. They gathered what knowledge they could salvage from Tython's ruins and left the world that had been their home. Their first new home was Ossus, far from the devastation. The first Jedi Council was formed on Ossus, the leadership structure that would guide the Order across all of galactic history to come. Masters shaped a new philosophical framework from the wreckage of the old one. What they carried with them from Tython was a combination of extraordinary accumulated wisdom and the fresh wounds of what that wisdom had failed to prevent. The Jedi were not the same as the Jedi. They were harder, more certain, more wary of their own capacity for darkness. Whether that certainty was the lesson their experience had earned them, or whether it was, in its own way, the kind of fixed conviction that had caused the Force Wars in the first place, was a question that the next 25,000 years of history would answer in ways they could not yet see. Across the rest of the galaxy, the Rakata continued their expansion. Tython was lost to them now, its Force signature too disrupted by the cataclysm for their Force hounds to track reliably. So they went elsewhere, as they always had. more worlds fell. More species were added to the roster of those who knew what it meant to live under absolute domination. The infinite empire stretched across thousands of star systems, a monument to what happens when power becomes an end in itself, with no limiting principle except the desire to acquire more of it. And then a plague swept through Rakata Prime. It came without warning and behaved in ways no disease had ever behaved before. It moved through Rakata populations and left survivors. But those survivors discovered that the power their entire civilization depended on was simply gone. Their connection to the Force had been severed. The Force Hounds who had made the Empire possible could no longer sense what they were trained to find. The technology that had depended on dark side energy went dark and silent. Hyperdrives stopped responding. Weapon systems failed across an entire empire simultaneously, across thousands of worlds at once. Enslaved species felt the grip on them loosen. The Rakata overseers who had maintained control through the terror of Force-enhanced power were suddenly ordinary beings with tools that did not work. The revolts needed no coordination. They needed no plan or signal or unified leadership. The realization that the Rakata were mortal spread faster than any message could carry it. Generations of accumulated suffering found expression in a single moment that was happening simultaneously across the entire galaxy. The infinite empire collapsed within a few generations. The infrastructure of conquest crumbled as the knowledge to maintain it died with those who had wielded it. The Rakata retreated to their homeworld and devolved into warring factions fighting over the remnants of a civilization they could no longer sustain. A species that had enslaved thousands of worlds spent the rest of its history struggling to remember what it had been. What caused the plague has never been conclusively determined. The most straightforward explanation is deliberate creation by one of the enslaved species. A biological weapon targeted at the mechanism allowing force sensitivity. Some ancient records describe what sounds like divine judgment. Others suggest the Force itself intervened, that the sustained suffering of billions of beings across centuries had accumulated into something that demanded release. Whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable. The beings of the galaxy were free for the first time in longer than most of them could remember. And freedom, as it turned out, created its own complications. Without the Rakata imposing their terrible order on galactic civilization, the species of the core worlds found themselves without a framework for existing alongside each other. They had resources and ambition and the desire to build something. What they lacked was any model except domination. And nobody wanted to replicate that. Simple isolation was not practical either. The trade networks the Rakata had built had created economic dependencies between worlds that could not be easily unwound without serious damage to the populations that depended on them. Representatives from Corellia, Alderaan, Coruscant, and the Duros' homeworld gathered to discuss something genuinely new, an alliance built on cooperation rather than conquest, a government deriving its authority from the consent of member worlds rather than from the capacity to destroy those who refused. After years of negotiation, after arguments that nearly ended the talks multiple times, after compromises that left everyone only partially satisfied, they signed the Galactic Constitution. The Galactic Republic was born. It began modestly. A Senate where different worlds sent representatives to argue about trade and borders and the thousand mundane concerns of civilizations not currently fighting for survival. A Supreme Chancellor elected by those senators to provide executive leadership. a shared legal framework protecting commerce, and discouraging violence between member worlds. It was imperfect from the very beginning, as every institution built by sentient beings is imperfect from the very beginning. But it was genuinely new, a government founded on the idea that different species could live and work together as something approaching equals, that the shared enterprise of civilization was worth the patience and compromise that making it work required. The timing of the Republic's founding coincided with a technological breakthrough that would define galactic civilization for the next 25,000 years. Corellian engineers had spent decades studying the wreckage of Rakata technology, particularly their hyperdrive systems. The Rakata drives had required force sensitivity to operate, making direct replication impossible, but the underlying principles of hyperspace travel could be understood and reconstructed using conventional physics. The hyperdrive the Corellians eventually developed was slower than what the Rakata had used and required more maintenance, but it worked for anyone. Not only for force-sensitive beings, for ordinary merchants and diplomats and explorers with no connection to the Force whatsoever. Galactic travel was no longer the exclusive province of the powerful. The Republic entered what historians call the expansionist era. New hyperlanes were mapped and established. The Perlemian trade route linked Coruscant to the Tython cluster, passing through Ossus, where the Jedi had made their new home. The Corellian run connected the industrial core worlds to resource-rich planets in the outer colonies. Different species began exchanging technology and cultural traditions in ways that produced things no single civilization could have created alone. Trade became more profitable than conquest. The Republic grew not primarily through military force, but through invitation. Member worlds saw what belonging offered and chose to join, and the Jedi found their place within all of it. The first contact between the Republic and the Jedi Order happened when Republic scouts exploring new hyperlane routes encountered the community the Jedi had been building on Ossus since leaving Tython. The meeting required careful navigation on both sides. The Jedi were understandably cautious after everything their history had put them through, and the Republic's emissaries had no framework for understanding an order of force-sensitive warriors who governed themselves by philosophical principles. But the negotiations produced an agreement that would shape the galaxy for the next 25,000 years. The Jedi would serve as guardians of peace and justice within the Republic. They would apply their abilities not for conquest, not for the benefit of any particular faction or species above any other, but for the protection of the innocent and the preservation of a civilization built on the idea that cooperation was superior to domination. In return, the Republic would support the Order and grant it the independence to operate without becoming anyone's political instrument. It worked better than anyone had predicted. The Jedi brought to the Republic something that power and commerce alone could never produce. They were incorruptible in a way that institutions built purely on self-interest could not be. Their dedication to principles above personal advancement made them uniquely effective wherever ordinary politics created incentives to look away from the truth. They developed new tools for their mission across these centuries, refining their understanding of the Force and their techniques for wielding it, always in service of the same core purpose. The Republic brought to the Jedi the scale and resources to extend their mission across a galaxy rapidly, becoming too large for any small order to tend alone. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Each institution reinforced the other's strengths and compensated for the other's blind spots. It was on its best days, exactly the partnership that both had needed. The Al-Sakan conflicts tested both institutions repeatedly over the millennia that followed. The people of Al-Sakan were an ancient and proud civilization who believed with some historical justification that their world, not Coruscant, deserved to be recognized as the center of galactic civilization. This belief, hardened by challenge into fixed position, produced 17 separate conflicts over 6,000 years. Each one escalated. Each one was eventually resolved through negotiation and Jedi mediation. Each resolution held for a while before something broke it again. 17 wars, 6,000 years. Neither civilization ended the other. The institutions held. The partnership between Republic and Jedi deepened with every crisis they survived together. And in the surviving and deepening, both became something more than they had been when they started. New worlds joined the Republic. New species contributed their cultures and resources to the shared enterprise. Technologies improved in ways that made daily life better for billions of beings who would otherwise have lived and died, knowing only the immediate concerns of their own worlds. Art forms cross-pollinated across hundreds of member worlds. The basic language spread as a practical necessity of trade and communication, and with it grew a sense that the different peoples of the galaxy were not merely neighboring civilizations, but members of something that transcended any single one of them. A shared civilization with a shared history and shared institutions, and, tentatively, a shared idea of what kind of future was worth building toward. It was never perfect. The Senate was susceptible to all the short-sightedness and self-interest that large bodies of representatives dependent on re-election have always been susceptible to. The Supreme Chancellor's office attracted leaders whose vision varied enormously in quality. Trade disputes festered. Border conflicts flared. Corruption existed from the beginning, as it always exists in any institution large enough to offer individuals the opportunity to abuse their positions. But the idea at the center held that different species could govern themselves together, that the strong did not have the right to simply take from the weak, that galactic civilization was worth protecting. The Jedi stood at the center of that idea as its most committed defenders. For thousands of years, the galaxy's story was this story. A republic reaching outward. A Jedi Order holding the center. The long, unglamorous work of making a shared civilization function well enough that most of its members preferred it to the alternatives. It was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable, sustained achievements in the history of any species, anywhere in the known galaxy. And at the edge of the known galaxy, in the Stygian Caldera region that Republic charts marked with warnings and very little else, something old and patient was waiting for its moment. Jory and Gav Daragon were not important people. They were traders working the outer edges of known space, hauling cargo between worlds too small and remote for the major shipping companies to bother with, staying one step ahead of debts that accumulated around them, regardless of how carefully they planned. They were skilled enough at what they did to keep flying and unlucky enough to make, in one desperate moment of navigation, a hyperspace jump that took them somewhere their charts had never mapped. What Republic records marked as empty space was not empty. The Sith civilization, the dark side tradition that had been developing its own philosophy and power in the Stygian Caldera for thousands of years in deliberate isolation, was very much alive. The species called the Sith, those red-skinned beings with a deep and ancient connection to the dark side of the Force, had spent the long centuries since the Rakata's fall building their own empire according to their own philosophy. That philosophy held that the strong should rule and the weak should serve. That power was the truest currency of the universe, and the force wielded without restraint through passion, and the willingness to take what was needed was the most direct expression of what the universe actually valued. Their lords had developed techniques for wielding the dark side in ways that were in some respects as sophisticated as anything the Jedi had produced through their light side tradition, and their empire was ruled by a figure whose ambitions were not merely territorial. His name was Naga Sadow. He was not quite the most powerful Sith Lord of his era, but he was the most dangerous, because he combined genuine force ability with a capacity for strategic thinking that most of his rivals lacked. When the Daragon ship dropped out of hyperspace in Sith territory, the response was immediate. The Sith did not receive unexpected visitors. They had protocols for exactly this situation, and those protocols began with capture. Jory and Garv were brought before the lords who would decide their fate. And here the dynamic between Sadow and his primary rival Ludo Kresh became the hinge on which galactic history turned. Kresh looked at two lost traders from Republic space and saw a harbinger of invasion. The Republic had found them. Kill the intruders immediately and strengthen the defenses. Sadow looked at the same situation and drew the exact opposite conclusion. These frightened humans were not a threat. They were a key to an invasion going in the other direction. Sadow had always wanted to conquer the Republic. The Sith Empire, formidable as it was, had been contained too long by its relative isolation. The galaxy beyond their borders was vast and wealthy and, from everything their intelligence suggested, insufficiently prepared for what organized Sith warfare could accomplish. All he needed was justification, and the Daragons had handed him the means to manufacture one. He engineered a crisis. He arranged what appeared to be a Republic rescue operation, staging a breakout from the intruders' custody in a way that made it look like Republic commandos had penetrated the heart of Sith space to retrieve their people. The lords who might have counseled restraint found themselves convinced that if the Republic already knew where they were and was already moving against them, the time for caution had passed. Sadow maneuvered himself into command of the invasion fleet. Jory Daragon was allowed to escape back to Republic space, her ship unknowingly carrying a tracking device that would guide the Sith Armada directly to its targets. Garv Daragon, who would not understand what he had helped set in motion until it was far too late to change anything, was kept as an advisor whose usefulness had already largely run its course. The Great Hyperspace War began without announcement. Republic worlds along the Outer Rim encountered Sith warships before anyone in the Senate had time to process what was happening. The fleet Sadow commanded was organized around Sith Lords who used the Force in combat in ways that Republic military doctrine had no framework for countering. Battle meditation, the ability to simultaneously strengthen your own force's will, while systematically undermining the enemy's resolve and coordination, turned individual engagements into routes that looked incomprehensible to outside observers. Force-powered weapons created effects that planetary defense systems had never been designed to face. The First Republic responses were disorganized and insufficient because the threat was categorically unlike anything living military commanders had ever encountered before. The Jedi Order was better positioned to understand what they were fighting. A Jedi scholar named Odan had spent years studying historical records about Sith techniques and the dark side philosophy underlying them. When the invasion began, and Republic forces found themselves unable to develop effective strategies against an enemy they didn't understand, Odan-Ur's knowledge became critical. He recognized the patterns in what Sado was doing. He identified the specific deception at the heart of the Sith commander's apparent superiority. The multiple fleets bearing down on Republic worlds simultaneously were not entirely real. Sado, maintaining his battle meditation from a command ship positioned safely at a remove from the fighting, was projecting phantom armadas. The force-driven mass hallucination was multiplying his actual forces in the perception of defenders who had no way to distinguish a real warship from a very convincing projection. Republic forces had been spreading themselves thin, chasing targets that did not exist, while Sado's real ships concentrated against positions left undermanned by exactly that spreading. Once Odan-Ur managed to communicate this through the Jedi network, the calculus of the war shifted. Republic commanders stopped chasing shadows and concentrated on confirmed targets. The defense of Coruscant held. Sith forces throughout Republic space found themselves facing opposition that was no longer dividing itself across illusions. And then Sado received news from home. Ludo Kresh had not been idle while his rival pursued glory. He had spent the war building support among lords who had doubts about Sado's leadership, waiting for the moment when military setbacks would make his authority vulnerable. When Kresh judged the moment right, he launched his coup. Sado, managing a faltering campaign from his command ship, learned that the power base he had left behind was crumbling under his rival's challenge. He chose his rule over his conquest. The Sith fleet began pulling back toward home territory. The Republic followed. A tracking device allowed Republic and Jedi forces to follow the retreating fleet back toward its source. What had begun as a desperate defensive war became an offensive campaign. The final confrontation took place in orbit above the Sith's own worlds, Republic warships closing in as Sado and Kresh fought each other in the last act of their rivalry. Sado destroyed his rival's flagship. It left him with barely enough ships to run when the Republic Navy arrived with overwhelming numbers. His final act was the kind of desperate gambit only someone with nothing left to lose could attempt. He retreated to a system where binary stars offered him access to ancient Sith superweapon technology. Through dark side ritual and forbidden knowledge, he caused one of those stars to go supernova. The explosion destroyed much of the pursuing Republic fleet and bought him the time he needed to escape. He fled to the remote jungle moon of Yavin 4 with his most loyal Massassi warriors. Dark side techniques would extend his life far beyond its natural span. He would live there for centuries, sustained by the Force and cut off from everything his ambition had been aimed at achieving. The Republic launched Operation Yellow Vapor in the aftermath, a systematic campaign to dismantle every remaining Sith presence in the Stygian caldera. World by world, Jedi and Republic forces moved through the ancient Sith territories, destroying whatever dark side tradition they found. Most Sith lords died fighting rather than surrender. A few scattered into deep space, isolated and powerless. The Republic celebrated what appeared to be complete victory. The Sith had been found and broken. The dark side threat was over. But one Sith Lord had not been present for any of the war. While Naga Sado built his invasion fleet and the great hyperspace war burned across both sides of the galaxy, a Sith who ruled the distant world of Nathema had been watching from a careful distance and developing plans that made conquest look modest by comparison. His name was Vitiate, and he had never wanted the same things that drove other Sith Lords. Where they wanted territory and recognition and the satisfaction of domination, he wanted something that transcended all of those things entirely. He wanted to consume the Force itself. to draw the life energy of all living things into himself, until death became a concept that no longer applied to him, until he was not merely powerful but effectively infinite, answerable to nothing, continuing forever, while everything around him eventually served as fuel. After Sado's defeat, Vitiate sent word to the surviving Sith Lords scattered across the galaxy. He offered them what they most needed in that desperate moment: sanctuary, a gathering of the powerful, a chance to rebuild what had been destroyed. They came from wherever they had been hiding, dozens of them, the most capable Force users the Sith tradition had produced in that generation, all traveling to Nathema, expecting a council of war to plan the next phase of Sith resurgence. What they found was a ritual. Vitiate had spent years preparing it. It drew on the deepest Sith knowledge ever assembled and pushed further into the dark than any of that knowledge had gone before. Every Sith Lord who had come to the gathering became fuel for it. Every plant on the planet, every creature, every microorganism in the soil and the water and the air. Vitiate poured the life force of an entire world into himself, in a sustained act of consumption that left Nathema not merely dead but permanently emptied of something that death alone does not remove. The planet's connection to the Force was severed, not damaged, not disrupted, severed completely. What remained was a wound in the invisible web connecting all living things, a place where the Force was simply absent, where Force-sensitive beings who later visited felt not pain but emptiness, a nothing so total that the mind recoiled from it, as though from something worse than any physical harm. Vitiate became something that transcended ordinary definition. He was no longer a living being in any recognizable sense. He had consumed so much that he had become something that used a physical body the way most beings use a vehicle. Something that could transfer its consciousness to new hosts if necessity demanded. He declared himself the Sith Emperor. He gathered the Sith loyalists who had not attended Nathema's ritual and led them into the unknown regions, into the vast, uncharted territory beyond the edge of known space, where the Republic's maps ended and the darkness beyond them began. By the time the Republic finished celebrating its apparent victory over the Sith threat, the real threat was already gone from sight, moving deeper into unexplored space, building something in the darkness that the galaxy would not encounter for nearly 1,000 years. The world he chose for his throne was called Dromund Kaas. It sat deep in the unknown regions, perpetually storm-racked, its skies continuously lit by lightning, its atmosphere heavy with dark side energy that pressed on the consciousness of everyone who lived there like a constant reminder of who ruled them and what they served. The Emperor built his throne. He built a city around his throne. He established the Dark Council, 12 Sith Lords, managing the administration of his empire under his supreme authority. He trained generation after generation of Sith in a tradition shaped entirely by his will and his philosophy, which held that all life in the galaxy existed ultimately to serve his purposes. And he waited, patiently, methodically, with the advantage that only an immortal being possesses. He could plan across timescales that would simply outlast any opposition. He did not need to move quickly. He needed to move correctly. While the Republic rebuilt and the memory of the Great Hyperspace War faded from urgent threat to historical footnote, the Sith Empire in the unknown regions grew generation by generation, New species were conquered and absorbed. Technologies were studied and improved. An army was built whose size, by the time it was finally ready to move, would exceed anything the galaxy's known powers had prepared for. The Republic had no way of knowing any of this was happening. The unknown regions were genuinely unknown, their navigational hazards severe enough that systematic exploration was essentially impossible with the technology of the era. For the better part of a millennium, the Republic's citizens went about their lives with the comfortable assumption that the Sith were gone, that the Great Darkness had been defeated once and for all, that the galaxy's threats were political and economic rather than existential. The darkness was counting on exactly that assumption. In the centuries that followed the Great Hyperspace War, the Republic rebuilt and continued its long expansion. New member worlds joined. Trade routes multiplied. The Jedi trained new generations in the philosophy they had been refining since Tython. Their understanding of the light side deepening with each decade of accumulated practice, and each conflict successfully resolved. They were, by any outward measure, an institution at the height of its confidence and capability. And in the middle of that confidence, quietly, a young Jedi named Freedon Nad made a choice that would ripple through the next 4,000 years of galactic history. Nad was gifted in ways that made his instructors uncomfortable. His Force connection was extraordinarily deep. His grasp of advanced techniques exceeded that of students who had trained for years longer. His potential, as his teachers noted with a mixture of admiration and unease, was genuinely exceptional. He also had a quality his teachers described as arrogance, and that Nad himself would have described as clarity. He could see that the Jedi's restrictions on certain areas of knowledge were limiting. He could feel what was available through paths the Order had foreclosed, and he believed, with the complete conviction of someone who has not yet fully grasped what certainty costs, that he was strong enough to use that power without being consumed by it. When the Jedi Order refused to grant him access to the knowledge he sought, Nad did not argue or appeal. He left. He traveled to Yavin 4, to the ancient temples that Naga Sadow had built in his long exile on that remote jungle moon, where dark side energy had been concentrating and deepening for centuries. Sadow had been dead for generations, but his influence had not departed with him. The dark side does not need a living host to persist. It saturates places where it has been channeled with sufficient intensity. It waits in the stones and the air, and the accumulated memory of ambition and violence, patient beyond the patience of any living being. Nad absorbed everything that Sadow had left in those temples. Sith alchemy, the manipulation of living things through dark side energy, capable of producing effects that no purely light side practitioner could achieve. Techniques for wielding the Force in ways the Jedi had classified as forbidden for reasons Nad had once dismissed as overcaution. And as he learned, the dark side did what it has always done to those who approach it, with the certainty that their own strength makes them immune to its effects. It changed him, not suddenly, not in ways that were visible from inside the experience of the change, but gradually, in the way that all the changes that matter most happen. The person who had left the Jedi Order became someone for whom the Jedi's concerns felt progressively less relevant to the life he was actually living. He left Yavin 4 and went to Onderon. Onderon was a world defined by a centuries-old conflict between its walled capital city, Iziz, and the warriors who had been exiled from it and had adapted to life in the dangerous wilderness outside the walls. The Beast Riders had formed bonds with the great creatures of Onderon's wild lands and had been fighting the city's rulers for so long that neither side clearly remembered how the original dispute had started. Nad conquered both sides. His mastery of the dark side was a force the people of Onderon had no framework to comprehend or oppose. He did not present himself as a conqueror. He presented himself as a solution. The war that had exhausted everyone for generations could end. All it required was accepting his authority. Given the power he demonstrated, this seemed less like a political choice and more like an acknowledgement of reality. He ruled for decades. Dark side techniques extended his lifespan far beyond what nature intended. He governed Onderon with the confidence of someone who understood that the dark side's gift of extended life was also a demonstration of who held power and who did not. When he finally died, he demanded entombment in a form that would preserve his influence beyond his physical ending. His tomb was constructed as a dark side nexus, saturated with the energy he had spent a lifetime channeling, designed to remain a source of power and corruption for those who came after him long after his body was gone. The royal family that traced its lineage to Nad's dynasty carried the dark side in their traditions for generations. The Nadists, those who actively revered his memory and sought to continue his work, maintained a presence in Onderon's culture for 2 centuries after his death. And the spirit of Freedon Nad, bound to the concentrated dark side energy in his tomb, continued influencing the living long after his body had gone. He would continue to do so for the next 200 years, one thread among many in the gathering storm that would eventually become the Great Sith War. By the time the Jedi Order became fully aware of what was developing on Onderon and sent a team to address it, the situation had been quietly building toward crisis for generations. Among the Jedi who answered that call was Ulic Qel-Droma, whose talent in the Force was matched by a confidence in his own judgment that would eventually carry him somewhere he could not have predicted when he boarded the ship for Onderon. His brother Kay traveled with him, and Nomi Sunrider, who had come to Jedi training through the particular crucible of watching her husband die delivering a holocron to safety, and who had emerged from that grief into abilities, particularly in the rare and powerful art of battle meditation, that were beginning to exceed those of masters who had trained for decades longer. They arrived on Onderon in the middle of a crisis that Nad's lingering influence had been quietly intensifying for years. The conflict between the city of Iziz and the Beast Riders, managed at a low simmer for generations, had erupted into something threatening to consume the planet entirely. The spirit of Freedon Nad was not merely a historical echo. He was working as much as a spirit bound to a place could work, to ensure that the dark side tradition he had established would survive and eventually flourish beyond his own time. The Jedi helped resolve the immediate crisis. They did not resolve the deeper one. Meanwhile, in the system of Empress Teta, 2 young nobles were making discoveries about Sith, knowledge that would set in motion one of the most devastating conflicts the Old Republic had faced in centuries. Alima and Satal Keto came from wealth and privilege and the particular restlessness that sometimes grows from too much of both. They had acquired Sith artifacts, spent considerable time with the dark side knowledge encoded in them, and convinced themselves that they could harness that power for their own political purposes. Their goals were not mystical. They wanted control of their system. The Sith knowledge was simply the most powerful tool they had found. They launched a coup that seized control of the Empress Teta system swiftly and completely. The legitimate rulers died. The organization they led called itself the Krath, and it established itself as the new power in the system, with the cold confidence of people who had recently discovered they were far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. The Jedi Council called a conclave at Deniba to determine how to respond. What happened at Deniba changed the course of everything that followed. The Krath sent war droids to the gathering. Good Jedi died in an assault on a convening meant for peaceful deliberation. And among those who survived, watching the Council weigh its response with a patience that felt, in the immediate aftermath of death, very much like the wrong emotion for the moment, was Ulic Qel-Droma. He had a plan. He would travel to the Empress Teta system and present himself as someone who had turned away from the Jedi path. He would gain the Krath's trust from the inside, learn everything about their operations and their dark side sources, and use that knowledge to dismantle them from within. The Council refused. They had seen this kind of reasoning before. The dark side's corruption was exactly this rational seeming, exactly this confident that the person proposing it was strong enough to handle what no one before them had successfully handled. Ulic went anyway. He reached Empress Teta. He killed Satal Keto. He began a complicated and increasingly genuine relationship with Alima Keto, the more capable and more dangerous of the two, whose mastery of Sith illusion was already more sophisticated than most dark side practitioners achieved without years of dedicated study. And step by step, with each compromise made in service of the cover story, with each dark side technique absorbed because maintaining the deception required it, with each genuine doubt suppressed because the mission seemed too important to abandon, Ulic Qel-Droma became something very close to the thing he had promised himself he was only pretending to be. At some point, the distance between the pretense and the reality collapsed entirely. The exact moment was not visible from inside the experience of the collapse. Far from Empress Teta, on Yavin 4, another trajectory was bending toward the dark side along a completely different path. A former Jedi apprentice named Exar Kun had left the Order when his refusal to accept limits made further training impossible, and had spent the time since pursuing knowledge entirely on his own terms. He followed the trail of Sith tradition to Onderon, to the tomb of Freedon Nad, and then further to Yavin 4 itself. The spirit of Freedon Nad appeared to him in those ancient temples, believing it had finally found the vessel it had been waiting for. What followed was a confrontation of wills, a spirit seeking possession, and a living being who had come to those temples seeking power rather than to be made an instrument of someone else's purpose. Kun emerged from that confrontation not as Nad's puppet but as a Sith Lord in his own right. Having broken the artifacts Nad needed to complete the possession and claimed their knowledge entirely for himself, he was transformed in ways he did not fully understand until later. The Jedi apprentice who had wanted forbidden knowledge became someone for whom power was not a means to understanding, but an end in itself. He built a double-bladed lightsaber, a weapon the Jedi had never encountered before, that announced his philosophical position visually before a single word was spoken. He brought the Massassi warriors of Yavin 4 under his command through Sith alchemy that reshaped their bodies and bound them to his purpose. And he went to find Ulic Qel-Droma. Their meeting was the collision of two descents into darkness that had taken very different paths to arrive at the same place. Ulic had gone to spy and been consumed by what he was pretending to be. Exar Kun had sought power deliberately and had built himself into something capable of holding it. When the Jedi Council sent representatives to confront them both, an ancient Sith spirit appeared in the Force, vast and old beyond reckoning, and declared Exar Kun the new Dark Lord of the Sith, with Ulic Qel-Droma as his second. The Great Sith War had arrived. Exar Kun struck at Ossus, the Jedi's great library world where the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years was housed in a single place. His assault, combined with the catastrophic consequences of a Sith superweapon Alima Keto deployed without fully understanding what it would do, sent a wave of stellar radiation across Ossus that killed thousands and forced the desperate evacuation of whatever knowledge could be saved before everything else burned. Centuries of accumulated Jedi wisdom were lost in hours. Ulic's campaign brought war to worlds that had known only peace, driven by something that had long since stopped being strategic calculation and had become a compulsion to damage institutions he had once sworn to protect. But there was a crack in Ulic Qel-Droma's darkness that it had never managed to fully seal. His brother Kay had never stopped believing that the person Ulic had become was not the only thing Ulic could be. When the two met on the battlefield and Kay refused to step aside or accept what he was seeing, the confrontation ended with Ulic killing him. In that moment, something in Ulic broke open. Not his Force connection, not his combat ability. Something deeper, something the dark side had been covering over for years, and that his brother's death stripped back to raw and total exposure. Nomi Sunrider used a technique so rare that most Jedi encountered it only in theoretical study. She severed Ulic from the Force, cut his connection to it as completely and permanently as a physical limb can be removed from a body. What Ulic experienced in the silence that followed was not relief. It was the full weight of everything he had done, stripped of the dark side's ability to make it feel justified. Arriving all at once with nowhere to look except directly at it, Exar Kun met his end differently. Surrounded on Yavin 4 by forces that would defeat him in any conventional confrontation, he performed a ritual to sacrifice his own physical body and bind his spirit to the temples themselves, preserving himself in the concentrated dark side energy of the ancient place. He was still there, centuries later, when a new generation of students stumbled into those ruins and discovered that what they had thought were empty temples were very much still occupied. But that chapter had not yet been written. The Great Sith War concluded with the immediate threat broken. The Republic could begin rebuilding. The Jedi could mourn their dead and begin shaping the generation that would follow. Ossus was devastated, its great library lost, its accumulated knowledge scattered or burned in hours. The Jedi Order was weakened in ways that would take decades to fully address. The Republic had paid a terrible price for the choices that had allowed the Krath to rise and Exar Kun to build his power unchallenged. And in the quiet that followed, the galaxy turned. The institutions of civilization did what they have always done in the aftermath of catastrophe. They survived, they endured, they rebuilt slowly, generation by generation, carrying the scars of what had happened and the hope of what might still be possible. For a time, the worst seemed to be behind them. The great dark powers that had threatened the Republic had been defeated. The Jedi were battered but standing. The Republic's foundations had held against everything thrown at them. What none of them knew, in those quiet years of rebuilding and cautious hope, was that the greatest trial in the history of the Old Republic had not yet begun. It was waiting, as the darkness always waits. for the right moment. In the unknown regions, in the perpetual storms above Dromund Kaas, the Sith Emperor watched every conflict, every death, every weakness exposed and every strength revealed, and calculated that the moment was not yet, but that it was coming. The centuries ahead would begin to move in directions no one on the Republic's side could see coming, would produce heroes and villains and choices whose consequences would echo further than the people making them could possibly imagine. The Old Republic had endured for tens of thousands of years. It had weathered the Rakata and the Force Wars and the Great Hyperspace War, and now the Great Sith War. It had always endured, but what comes next would ask more of it than anything that came before. Mandalore the Ultimate came to power with a vision for his warrior people that combined ancient tradition with new organizational sophistication. He wanted war, not for territory or resources or the accumulation of wealth, but for the particular hardening that only genuine struggle against a worthy opponent produces. His people were warriors in the deepest sense, a civilization that had organized itself entirely around the virtues of combat. And he believed that without war, against a truly challenging enemy, those virtues would soften and fade until his people were warriors in name only. He called what he envisioned the Great Hunt, and he set about building the instrument that would make it real. The Neo-Crusaders were unlike any Mandalorian force that had come before. Previous Mandalorian armies had been collections of individual clans, each fighting in their own style, loyal to their own leaders, difficult to coordinate but fearsome in the raw quality of individual warriors. Mandalore, the Ultimate, imposed standardization, unified equipment, unified tactics, a unified identity that reached across clan boundaries and offered something almost ideological. Join the Neo-Crusaders, and you were not merely fighting alongside Mandalorians. You were becoming one, regardless of where you had come from or who your people had been before. He chose the Republic as his target because the Republic represented the greatest possible challenge. He began at the edges of Republic space, where the Senate's attention and the military's resources were thinnest, where planetary defense forces could be overwhelmed before reinforcements arrived. World after world fell to the Neo-Crusader advance. The Mandalorians moved through the Outer Rim like a tide that could not be turned. Planets that had been part of the Republic for generations suddenly had to decide whether to fight and die or submit and survive on Mandalorian terms. Many chose to fight. Many paid the price that choice demanded. The Neo-Crusaders were not interested in random destruction, which would have been simpler to organize a resistance against. They were methodical. They tested each world's capacity to resist, then exceeded it. They were looking for the worthy, and their definition of worthy meant those who could hold on longest before losing, which was not the same as those who could hold on at all. And the Senate debated, and more worlds fell. And the Republic's response was cautious in ways that frustrated everyone watching it. The Jedi Council counseled patience. They could sense something in the Force connected to the Mandalorian advance that did not fit, a darkness whose source they could not locate, a sense that larger forces were shaping events in ways not visible from the surface, sending the Jedi into a conflict whose full context they did not yet understand seemed genuinely unwise when they could not identify what was actually driving it. The Council's caution was not cowardice. It was the honest acknowledgement of incomplete information. But to those watching from worlds being burned, it felt indistinguishable from paralysis. Two Jedi could not share the Council's patience. Revan was the most analytically dangerous kind of military commander. someone who combined strategic intelligence with an intuitive grasp of the Force's capacity to reveal patterns that pure tactical analysis would miss. He understood problems as systems, saw the relationships between their parts, and moved his forces to exploit the vulnerabilities those relationships created. He could think 3 engagements ahead while simultaneously thinking 3 decades ahead and hold both timescales in his mind, without losing clarity about either. Malak was his closest companion, loyal with the particular intensity that comes from long partnership and genuine admiration, someone who had spent so long following Revan's judgment that distinguishing his own assessment from Revan's had become genuinely difficult. Together they took a group of Jedi into the Mandalorian Wars against the Council's explicit decision, and they were effective beyond what anyone who stayed behind could fully account for. The tactics they developed, the Force-guided strategic vision Revan brought to every engagement, began turning the tide of a war that had been going badly for the Republic's conventional forces. More Jedi followed. The conflict became, for a period, the cause that young Jedi with strong convictions and the will to act on them went to, regardless of what the Council had decided. Revan's prosecution of the war grew increasingly ruthless in ways that won battles efficiently but made even some of those following him uncomfortable. He was willing to accept costs that pure Jedi ethics would have questioned. He was willing to study Sith artifacts encountered in the field, to learn directly from the dark side tradition embedded in the history of the worlds they were fighting across. None of this felt like falling from the inside. It felt like understanding the enemy deeply enough to defeat them, which is what the beginning of falling almost always feels like, from the inside. The war's final confrontation came at Malachor V. A weapon called the Mass Shadow Generator, designed to turn a planet's own gravity into an instrument of annihilation, was activated over the battlefield at the moment of maximum engagement. It worked exactly as designed. The Mandalorian fleet was destroyed. Mandalore the Ultimate was dead. The Neo-Crusaders who survived surrendered without condition. Republic forces barely escaped the gravity field before it killed everyone who could not reach jump threshold in time. The toll was staggering on both sides. The battle's survivors described the moment of the weapon's activation not as a victory, but as a horror, something that left a scar in the Force so severe that sensitive beings could feel it decades later as a wound that had not healed. Meetra Surik, who commanded the Republic forces that activated the weapon, severed herself from the Force in the immediate aftermath, the unconscious act of a mind trying to protect itself from the scale of death it had just been part of creating. On Malachor V's surface, in the silence that followed a victory that had cost everything it could take, Revan stood and felt something he had not anticipated. Not triumph, a direction in the Force pointing not back toward the Republic but outward, toward the unknown regions, toward a darkness he had been sensing for longer than he had admitted to himself. It was not a vague feeling, it was a pull, specific and insistent, and growing stronger the more clearly he attended to it. He and Malak went to find out what it was. What waited in the unknown regions was the thing that had been building in the darkness for 1,000 years. The Sith Emperor had known they were coming. He had, in ways that even Revan would only fully understand much later, made sure they were coming. The Mandalorian Wars had been seeded through influences that left no obvious trace back to Dromund Kaas, designed to produce exactly the kind of battle-hardened, limit-testing, dark-side curious Jedi that Revan and Malak had become by the time they walked toward the Emperor's throne. The confrontation in that throne room was brief in physical terms and complete in its consequences. Vitiate's power was of a scope that even Revan's extraordinary abilities could not simply overcome. He broke both of them and rebuilt them, showing them through direct encounter with what he was and what he intended the dark side in its most total expression. What they experienced in those moments changed the direction of their purpose in ways that would take years to fully manifest. Revan retained enough of himself to form something that still resembled a plan. He would not serve the Emperor's agenda. He would use what he had learned to stop it. He would build a Sith empire aimed at the Republic, not to destroy the Republic, but to harden it, to force it to develop the strength and will necessary to survive what he now understood was actually coming. It was a plan of extraordinary arrogance and genuine care, twisted by the dark side, until the line between the strategic Sith Lord and the actual Sith Lord became impossible to locate from either direction. Darth Revan, Darth Malak. The names they took as they returned to the Republic they had once defended. They came back not as the Emperor's servants, but with their own designs. Revan's strategic genius, now shaped by Sith philosophy and amplified by dark knowledge he had absorbed in the unknown regions, built a Sith empire from remnants of Mandalorian forces, conquered worlds, and disillusioned Republic citizens and soldiers who believed in strength above all else. It grew faster than the Republic's military establishment could process. The Star Forge, an ancient Rakatan space station Revan had located through his research into Force-related relics, became the manufacturing heart of his campaign, capable of producing warships and droids at a rate that conventional industry could not match. Its dark side energies, drawing on the suffering and ambition of those who operated it, amplified the output further. The station was never merely a factory. It was a wound in the Force that happened to make ships. For 2 years, the Sith Empire pressed the Republic to the edge of destruction. World after world fell. Jedi Knights, who went to confront the two former heroes, found themselves facing commanders who knew Jedi tactics from the inside, who could anticipate their moves with the precision of people who had once trained in the same traditions. The Republic's Senate debated, its military scrambled, its Jedi Order, still recovering from the losses of both the Great Sith War and the Mandalorian Wars, struggled to field enough capable knights to hold anything. The campaign that changed everything was not a military victory. It was an ambush. The Jedi Council, in an act of calculated desperation, authorized a mission to capture Revan. A small strike team would board his flagship, attempt to take him alive, and bring him before the Council for judgment. The plan hinged on an ability that one of the participating Jedi had developed to an extraordinary degree. Bastila Shan was young, possibly too young for the weight being placed on her, but her mastery of battle meditation and her gift for connecting with the Force in other beings made her the Council's best hope for something so improbable as taking Darth Revan alive rather than simply fighting him. The mission partially succeeded and partially failed in ways the Council had not anticipated. Revan's flagship was boarded. In the chaos, Malak betrayed his master, turning his own ship's cannons on Revan's bridge. Whether this was calculated elimination of a rival or a decision made in the heat of an opportunistic moment, historians have argued about ever since. The result was that Revan was mortally wounded, his mind shattered by the concentrated blast. Bastila Shan reached him in that moment. Because of the Force bond that formed between them in the contact of his dying and her reaching to pull him back from it, something unprecedented happened. she saved him, not by healing his body, but by using the bond to anchor his consciousness, drawing him back from the edge he had reached. She brought him back to the Jedi Council, not as the prisoner they had planned to take, but as something stranger. A man without a memory, a mind too damaged to hold what it had been. A blank page on which something new could be written. The Council made a decision that has troubled the history of the Jedi Order ever since. They gave Revan a new identity, not the slow rehabilitation of someone who might be reasoned with and guided toward redemption from a position of full knowledge, but the deliberate construction of a new person, a Republic soldier with no access to who Darth Revan had been. The logic was clear, however disturbing. Revan had knowledge about the Starforge and about the Sith Empire's structure that the Republic needed. That knowledge lived somewhere in the damaged architecture of his mind. And a new Revan, one who did not know what he was, might be guided toward the star maps that would lead to the Starforge without ever knowing he was retracing his own footsteps. And so the mission that followed was one of the strangest in galactic history. A man who did not know he had once led the enemy was sent, with Bastila and a small crew, to find the information that would let the Republic destroy what he had built. He found the first star map on Dantooine. Then others scattered across the galaxy, each a fragment of a route leading to the Starforge. Kashyyyk's ancient forests, where the trees themselves seemed to hold memory in their roots. Tatooine's vast desert, where the heat erased everything and left only what could survive without erasure. Manaam's ocean cities, neutral and careful and watchful in the way that places staying out of someone else's war have always been watchful. Korriban itself, the ancient Sith homeworld, now occupied by Malak's forces, where the very tombs of long-dead Sith lords whispered to the person who had once walked among the living as their lord. Each world did something to him, not just giving him another piece of the route he was following, but surfacing something from underneath the constructed identity he had been given. The Force worked through the places he went, and the people he met, and the choices he made in ways that the Jedi Council, in constructing his new identity, had perhaps not fully accounted for. He was not just gathering star map fragments, he was gathering fragments of himself. And the self-assembling beneath the surface was not entirely the person the Council had designed, and not entirely Darth Revan, but something that contained parts of both and was becoming, slowly, genuinely his own. The Force bond with Bastila deepened into something neither of them had anticipated or chosen, something that carried both of them into territory that Jedi training had not fully prepared either for. And Malak, having learned that Revan was alive and that the Jedi were using him as an instrument against his own former empire, wanted him found and destroyed, not primarily because he feared what Revan might become again, but because Revan's existence was a constant reminder of what Malak had done to get where he was. Bastila's capture by Malak changed the trajectory of everything. She resisted at first, held her identity against the pressure he applied with patience and skill. But Malak was practiced at wearing at defenses, and isolation and exhaustion, and the accumulated weight of guilt and fear all created the conditions in which even strong convictions begin to yield. Bastila fell to the dark side, and the battle meditation that had been one of the Republic's most powerful advantages became Malak's. The final confrontation happened at the Starforge itself. Revan, with the memories of who he had been returning in fragments that had not yet resolved into complete coherence, faced first Bastila and then Malak, in a place built by the same ancient dark-side civilization, whose ruins had started everything. The conversation between Revan and Malak at the heart of the station was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a reckoning between what had been and what remained. Malak had made himself what he was through choices that began with betrayal and continued with every subsequent act of consolidation. Revan, whatever he was in that moment, was something different, something that had been broken and rebuilt, and was choosing, this time, to be something other than what the dark side wanted. Malak died at the Star Forge. In his final moments, stripped of the power that had sustained him, he saw clearly what he had become and how far the path he had chosen had taken him from anything worth the name. It was not redemption in any complete sense. It was recognition. Sometimes, that is the most that the dark side allows at the end. The Star Forge was destroyed. The Sith Empire, built on Revan's original plans, collapsed without the manufacturing capacity that had made it viable. The Republic survived. The Jedi Civil War was over. But the wounds it left were not. 3 figures emerged from the wreckage of the war, not as remnants of Revan's empire, but as something that had been growing separately in the shadows between the conflict's burning fronts. They called themselves the Sith Triumvirate. Their names were Darth Traya, Darth Nihilus, and Darth Sion. Between them, they represented 3 different expressions of what the dark side does to a person when it is taken to its most complete extreme. Traya was the most complicated of the 3. She had been a Jedi Master once, a keeper of the Academy on Dantooine, a teacher whose understanding of the Force ran genuinely deep. She had also been Revan's teacher in the years before the Mandalorian Wars, and watching a student she had shaped walk into darkness had done something to her philosophy that could not be undone. She came to believe that the Force itself, the invisible energy connecting all living things, was fundamentally a wound inflicted on all of them. That the constant cycle of Jedi and Sith, light side and dark side, was a cosmic game in which living beings were nothing but pieces, moved and discarded according to the Force's own needs and patterns. She wanted to end the cycle, to break the Force itself. She was brilliant and sincere and deeply, profoundly dangerous. Nihilus was something else entirely. His origin lay in the aftermath of Malachor V, in the mass death, concentrated into a single moment at a place already saturated with dark side energy. What emerged from that crucible was a being whose connection to the Force had been inverted. Where ordinary beings drew sustenance from the Force, Nihilus drew it inward and consumed it. He became a wound in the Force in his own right, a walking absence that could drain the life from entire populations, leaving worlds silent and himself still hungry. There are accounts of what it was like on the worlds he targeted before he had finished with them. Not accounts from survivors, because there were no survivors once he had finished. Accounts from those who arrived afterward, who found cities intact and streets empty, and every living thing, from the largest being to the smallest organism in the soil, simply gone, taken, consumed. The Force itself feeling thin in those places, stretched out, like a cloth pulled until the weave shows through. He wore a mask, because what was behind it no longer resembled a face in any meaningful sense. He did not have goals in the conventional sense. He had hunger. Sion was different from both. He had been a Sith soldier, physically ruined in battle, who had discovered that hatred was sufficient to substitute for a body that had reached its limits. He held himself together through pure dark side rage. His form a ruin of scars and broken bones that had fused and refused to die because he refused to let them. He was unkillable in the practical sense, because killing him required destroying not his body, but his will to continue. And his will was the one thing he had left that was entirely his. He served Traia and hated her for it, and could not bring himself to stop, because to stop would mean acknowledging that her usefulness to him had run out, and she remained useful longer than he ever wanted to admit. The three of them moved against the Jedi with a comprehensiveness the Order had never faced before. They were not building an empire. They were not interested in conquest. They wanted the Jedi gone, exterminated, removed from the galaxy so completely that the cycle Traia despised could not repeat. Jedi Masters died on isolated worlds, with no witnesses. The Jedi Enclave on Dantooine was destroyed. Conclave after conclave ended with the deaths of everyone who attended. Within a few years of the end of the Jedi Civil War, the Jedi Order had been reduced from a functioning institution to a scattered handful of survivors, each one hiding alone, each one uncertain whether anyone else had made it. Into this near extinction came Meetra Surik. She had been one of Revan's most trusted generals during the Mandalorian Wars. She had given the order to activate the mass shadow generator at Malachor 5. She had survived the weapon's activation and then severed herself from the Force in the immediate shock of what she had done. A disconnection so complete that the Jedi Council, when she finally returned to stand before them, had been left with no choice but to exile her. She had spent years in the Republic's margins after that, carrying the weight of Malachor 5 without the Force to help bear it, or the institutional support of the Order to lean on, or the certainty of purpose that had once made difficult decisions feel like necessary ones rather than wounds that wouldn't close. She had learned to exist without the Force, the way someone learns to exist without a sense they were born with. Not by replacing it, but by building a life around the absence of it, around the particular quiet of a galaxy that was no longer speaking to her the way it once had. She was not quite alive to purpose, and not quite willing to be finished with purpose entirely. She was somewhere in between, which is where most people spend more of their lives than the histories tend to record. When the Sith Triumvirate began its systematic hunting of surviving Jedi, something in her stirred. A connection to the Force that had been dormant for years began to wake. Meetra Surik went looking for survivors, not to rebuild an institution, but because each person she found was someone who would die if she did not find them first. She gathered companions the way people gather people in desperate times, because they were the ones willing to keep moving through circumstances that stopped everyone else. Kreia appeared among those companions, a former Jedi Master who offered guidance that was never entirely what it appeared to be. Her interest in Meetra was something she kept carefully obscured behind wisdom that was genuine and insight that was real and purposes that were neither. It took time for what Kreia actually was to become clear. She was Traia, the same person who was directing the hunt for Jedi survivors, was also traveling with the one person who might be able to stop it. Because Traia needed Meetra for something specific and needed her willing. The journey through the Dark Wars brought Meetra to the remaining Masters, each one fractured and isolated. She was connected to them through the Force in ways that made their fragmentation also hers. As she healed, they were drawn back. As she found herself again, something of what they had lost returned with her. She was a wound in the Force that had become something else, something that could restore what had been broken, rather than only consuming what was whole. She confronted Nihilus above Telos, in a battle whose peculiarity matched everything else about him. She was a wound in the Force herself, in a different sense. When he reached toward her with the hunger that had consumed entire worlds, he found something he could not consume. The contact that should have drained her drained him instead. Nihilus died of a kind of starvation in the middle of an attempted feast. Sion required a different approach. Not a stronger blade or a better strategy. Mitra fought him to the point where he should have died, and he refused to stay down. And she fought him again, and he refused again, and she stopped fighting and talked to him instead. She asked him if he wanted what he had, the existence he was maintaining through rage. She asked him what he was actually holding on to underneath the hatred that was holding him together. She waited. And Sion, who had not been spoken to as though he might still be a person in a very long time, let go. He died, as people die when they decide they are done. The final confrontation with Traya happened on Malachor V itself, at the heart of the wound that the mass shadow generator had created, and that had been shaping everything ever since. Traya revealed her actual purpose. She believed the Force was not a gift, but a chain, that the Jedi and the Sith were both its instruments, moved through the galaxy by an energy that served its own patterns without regard for what those patterns cost. The living beings caught inside them. She wanted to break it, to wound it deeply enough to end the cycle of chosen ones and dark lords and the endless tide of ordinary people destroyed by both. It was coherent. It was sincere. And Mitra defeated her anyway, because whatever the Force was, destruction was not the answer to it. And because Traya, for all her genuine understanding of the dark side's nature, had been consumed by it, in the way that everyone who reaches for the dark side at that depth eventually is. The Dark Wars ended with Malachor V's final destruction. The wound the battle had created was sealed. The Sith triumvirate was gone, and the Jedi Order, reduced to the handful that had survived Traya's hunt, began the long and difficult process of rebuilding from almost nothing. What followed was 3 centuries of relative quiet, which does not mean 3 centuries of peace. The Republic continued its complicated and imperfect existence. Political crises replaced military ones. Trade disputes required diplomatic solutions. The Jedi Order, rebuilding slowly on purpose, trained new generations with depth of wisdom rather than speed, establishing their temple on Tython once more in a return to their oldest roots that carried more symbolism than most of those making the choice fully understood. Then the skies split open. The Great Galactic War began without warning when a Sith armada emerged from the unknown regions and struck Republic targets along the Outer Rim before anyone in the Senate had processed what they were seeing. The Sith Empire that the Emperor had spent 1,000 years building in the darkness of Dromund Kaas was finally revealing itself, and the scale of what it had become was beyond anything the Republic's intelligence services had imagined possible. Fleets that dwarfed anything in the Republic's records. Sith commanders whose power had been honed through centuries of training under an immortal Emperor's guidance. Technology that in several areas was decades ahead of what the Republic had been developing. The Sith had used their 1,000 years of preparation well. Their strategy was methodical and devastating. Rather than attempting total conquest immediately, they targeted key trade routes and industrial worlds that would degrade Republic resistance over time. Balmorra, one of the galaxy's most important droid manufacturing centers, fell to Imperial assault. A major trade route was blockaded, cutting off outer rim worlds from the core and creating economic chaos throughout Republic space. The Republic's forces, shaped by 3 centuries without major military conflict, scrambled to adapt to an enemy they had not prepared for and had not believed could possibly exist. On Alderaan, a Republic trooper named Jace Malcolm and his squad demonstrated what courage could accomplish against overwhelming force, helping repel an Imperial assault led by Darth Malgus, one of the Emperor's most capable military commanders. The victory mattered not because it changed the military balance, but because it demonstrated something the Republic desperately needed to know. The Sith could be hurt, their soldiers bled. This was a war that could be fought. Even if fighting, it was going to cost everything. For nearly 3 decades, the Great Galactic War raged across dozens of worlds simultaneously. The Republic bled territory and resources and lives. The Empire consolidated gains and pressed forward. Heroes emerged on both sides, figures whose names would eventually become part of a history that nobody living through the war had any way to see as history rather than as daily catastrophe. The Jedi, never entirely comfortable with the role of frontline warriors, found themselves in it because there was no one else who could counter what the Sith were doing on the battlefield. The Republic's military adapted to fighting Force-using commanders. The war changed both sides in ways that outlasted it. What the histories of this war often fail to fully convey is what it looked like from below. From the perspective of the farmer on Balmorra who watched Imperial transports land and understood that everything they knew about their life was over. From the perspective of the Republic soldier who fought the same ground 3 times in a single year, winning it back and losing it and winning it back again, each cycle costing lives for a measure of progress that the next battle could erase. From the perspective of the families on worlds far from the fighting, who received news so slowly and in forms so incomplete that they often didn't know whether someone they loved was alive or dead for months at a time. The Great Galactic War was the largest conflict the galaxy had seen in centuries. And it consumed ordinary people in the way that large conflicts always consume ordinary people, thoroughly and without particular notice. By the time both sides were approaching genuine exhaustion, the military map showed an empire controlling vast regions of the outer and mid-rim, with the Republic holding the core worlds and struggling to push back effectively. The war was grinding toward a stalemate. Neither side could sustain indefinitely, and the Sith Emperor, who had survived 1,000 years of preparation, was not going to accept a stalemate when he had a better option. He offered peace talks. He invited Republic leadership to meet on Alderaan to negotiate terms. The Republic, war-weary and desperate for relief, sent its diplomats in good faith. The sacking of Coruscant was the most audacious military operation in the history of the galaxy and one of the most deliberate acts of calculated treachery ever recorded. While the Republic's leadership traveled to Alderaan for negotiations, Darth Malgus led an Imperial strike force directly to Coruscant. The timing was not coincidence. The intelligence allowing the Sith to bypass Coruscant's defenses had been gathered over years specifically for this moment. The Jedi Temple, the heart and symbol of the Order's commitment to protecting the Republic, was stormed and burned. The Senate District was devastated by orbital bombardment. The Supreme Chancellor was killed during the assault, decapitating the Republic's civilian government at the precise moment it was already leaderless by the Emperor's design. With Coruscant under occupation and its orbital defense platforms under Sith control, the Republic had no leverage. The Treaty of Coruscant, signed shortly after, was catastrophically unfavorable. Massive territorial concessions gave the Empire control of roughly half of known space. Worlds that had been part of the Republic for thousands of years were handed over. The Republic was reduced to its core and a handful of scattered territories, its military exhausted, its government humiliated, its greatest city still bearing the scars of an attack it had not seen coming. The treaty's signing began what historians would call the Cold War. Open hostilities ended, but both sides prepared for their inevitable resumption. The Republic used the breathing space to rebuild its military and fortify its remaining territories. The Jedi, forced to reckon with the changed political situation on Coruscant, returned to Tython, establishing a new temple on the ancient homeworld their tradition had abandoned so long ago. The symbolism was intentional. They were going back to their roots. They were acknowledging that what had been lost might need to be rebuilt from the beginning. The Cold War held for about a decade before it collapsed. Provocations from extremists on both sides, covert operations that exceeded what the treaty allowed, proxy conflicts on worlds caught between the two powers gradually eroded the fragile peace until it was gone entirely and open warfare resumed. The renewed conflict saw the Republic begin making territorial recoveries. The liberation of Balmorra, occupied for decades, demonstrated that the Empire could be pushed back. And through all of it, the Emperor pursued his true objective, the ritual that would allow him to consume all life in the galaxy, a culmination for which everything else had been preparation. When that attempt was disrupted by a Jedi who reached him on his throne world, his physical form was apparently destroyed. But Vitiate was not easily destroyed. His spirit survived, migrating through hosts, persisting in the galaxy he intended to eventually consume. The wars of the Storta era ground on for years after that. The Republic and the Empire locked in a conflict that exhausted both sides without resolving anything fundamental. It was a conflict without a decisive ending, because the forces driving it had not themselves been resolved. The Emperor's spirit endured, the Sith Empire endured, the Republic endured, and the galaxy that had been shaped by tens of thousands of years of this cycle continued turning, carrying the weight of everything that had happened within it. Centuries passed. The new Sith Wars that eventually erupted in the Outer Rim were the final major convulsion of the Old Republic era before the darkness took its most concentrated and patient form. Wave after wave of Sith challenges rose and were defeated, each cycle leaving the Republic and the Jedi Order a little more worn, a little less certain that the darkness could ever be fully extinguished, rather than merely pushed back temporarily. The wars were long and the suffering was real and the victories were real too, but the pattern they were part of seemed to have no end. The Jedi Order lost members it could not quickly replace. The Republic committed resources that took generations to restore. Each dark side challenger who emerged seemed to learn from those who had come before, avoiding the specific mistakes that had defeated the previous generation while making new ones that would in turn become lessons for whoever came after. The cycle was not without cost to those who sustained it. It was grinding work, the work of holding something together against forces that kept finding new ways to pull at it, and the grinding showed in the Republic's institutions, and in the Order's numbers, and in the quiet exhaustion of beings who had been doing this for longer than any individual lifetime. The Brotherhood of Darkness was what the new Sith Wars produced at their final phase. A Sith Lord named Khan gathered the dark side traditions that had survived into a single organization that proposed something different. all Sith Lords equal. No single master dominating. A collective of the powerful, coordinated rather than competing. It was, in its way, a reimagining of what a Sith Order could be, stripped of the hierarchy through assassination that had always made Sith organizations self-destructive. Lord Khan was charismatic and capable. His idea of equality among Sith Lords was also an idea that powerful Sith Lords spent considerable energy trying to undermine while publicly endorsing. The Brotherhood was effective in open combat and fundamentally unstable in exactly the way that any organization of individuals who each secretly believe they are most qualified for supreme authority tends to be unstable. One of its members saw through it with a clarity that made continued membership impossible. Darth Bane had come to the Brotherhood through standard Sith recruitment, proven himself in battle, earned his title through the demonstrations of power and cunning the tradition demanded. He was brilliant and ruthless, and, by the time he began studying the history of Sith philosophy seriously, increasingly convinced that the Brotherhood was not just strategically flawed, but philosophically corrupt. Sith equality was a contradiction in terms. The dark side rewarded individual power. Individual power required individual domination. An organization premised on pretending otherwise was a Sith club, and clubs did not win against armies with a genuine command structure. He went looking for something that would show him what a genuine Sith Order looked like at its most fundamental. What he found in an ancient holocron created by Darth Revan himself was an answer he had not expected. The true power of the Sith, Revan's teachings held, had always been diluted by numbers. An organization of many Sith Lords meant many competing wills, each one pulling against the others, each one limiting what the others could achieve. The history of the Sith was a history of self-destruction, of Dark Lords killing each other when coordination would have been decisive, of empires built on dark side philosophy collapsing, because dark side philosophy made the people building them constitutionally unable to trust each other with what empires require: sustained cooperation, shared purpose, the capacity to serve something larger than personal ambition. The solution Revan proposed was not more Sith, it was fewer. Two. Only two at any given time. One master to hold the power and pass on the knowledge. One apprentice to learn the power and desire the master's position. The tension between them would drive both to excel. The master would have to remain worthy of the title or be displaced. The apprentice would have to earn advancement rather than simply waiting for it. And the line of two would continue. Master replaced by apprentice, replaced by new apprentice, across as many generations as the galaxy required, without the self-destruction that multiplying Sith Lords had always produced. The rule of two. Bane saw in it the answer he had been looking for. What he understood, standing in the aftermath of every failed Sith organization in galactic history, was that the problem had never been insufficient darkness. There had always been enough darkness. The problem had been what darkness did to the people wielding it when too many of them occupied the same space. It turned them against each other at the worst possible moments. It made them incapable of the sustained cooperation that defeating the Republic required. The Sith had won 100 individual battles in their history and lost every long campaign because eventually, always, they destroyed each other before they could destroy the enemy. Two would not destroy each other because two could not afford to. The master needed the apprentice to learn everything they knew and surpass it. The apprentice needed the master to teach them everything they did not yet know. The dependency ran both directions. That dependency was the mechanism that would finally make the Sith sustainable. He moved to implement it in the most decisive way available. The Brotherhood of Darkness had gathered its full membership at Ruusan, where a series of battles against the Republic and the Army of Light under Jedi Lord Hoth had brought both sides to mutual exhaustion. Lord Khan, under pressure from the conflict and from Bane's persistent manipulations of the Brotherhood's internal politics, agreed to deploy a weapon called the Thought Bomb. It was a construct of pure dark side energy that, when detonated, would consume every Force-sensitive being in its radius, regardless of whether they served the light or the dark. Every Jedi, every Sith, every sensitive being present, Bane arranged to be absent when it was used. The Thought Bomb detonated in the Valley of Ruusan. Every Sith Lord in the Brotherhood of Darkness died, their spirits trapped in the dark side construct, neither fully dead nor able to move on, imprisoned in a darkness that persisted for decades. Every Jedi in the Army of Light who was present died alongside them. The Valley of Ruusan became a place where the Force itself bore the weight of what had been consumed, where the echoes of 10,000 deaths in a single moment left a mark on the living energy of the galaxy that sensitive beings could feel for generations. From that moment, there was one Sith left alive, Darth Bane, and one apprentice. He had already begun training in secret. Darth Zannah, a young girl whose native strength in the dark side was extraordinary, who had survived Ruusan by fortune and been found by Bane in the aftermath, and who would begin the line that the Rule of Two was designed to extend indefinitely into the galaxy's future. The galaxy believed the Sith were gone. The Jedi surveyed Ruusan's aftermath and concluded that the dark side tradition had finally been broken, that no organized Sith presence remained to threaten the Republic. This conclusion was accurate by every metric they had available and completely wrong by the metric that actually mattered. The Sith had not been destroyed. They had been reduced to exactly the number Bane considered optimal. The Ruusan Reformation reorganized the Republic's political and military structure in the aftermath, stripping certain authorities from the Jedi as an institution, reasserting civilian control over military decisions, generally reorganizing galactic governance under the assumption that the great threats were behind them. The Republic demilitarized significantly. The Jedi returned to their role as peacekeepers rather than warriors. It all made sense given the assumption it was built on, which was that the darkness had been defeated. It was a reasonable assumption. Every metric available to those making it supported it. The Jedi surveyed every shadow they could find and found no Sith. The intelligence services scanned the galaxy and found no Sith Empire. The historians looked at the record and concluded that what had ended at Ruusan was the cycle of Sith challenges that had been recurring since before the Great Hyperspace War. They wrote this conclusion into the official record. They taught it to the next generation, and the next generation taught it to the one after that, until 1,000 years had passed, and it had stopped being a conclusion and become a premise, something assumed rather than argued for, the kind of truth that doesn't get questioned because it stopped being a theory and became the background against which everything else was understood. Two shadows moved through the galaxy while the Republic reformed and the Jedi resumed their peacekeeping work. Training, planning, building the knowledge base the Rule of Two required. Every generation producing a master and an apprentice who together held the complete inheritance of Sith philosophy without the dilution that had always destroyed it before. If any given pair died without a successor, the line ended and everything was lost. If they survived, they trained the next. The mathematics were simple. The discipline required to maintain them across centuries was extraordinary. 1,000 years passed. The galaxy aged around two shadows that the galaxy did not know existed. The Republic grew and stagnated and reformed and grew again, its institutions cycling through the patterns that large and old institutions tend to cycle through. The Jedi Order built its great temple on Coruscant and trained its knights and fulfilled its mission with the patient institutional competence of an organization that had survived everything and expected to survive everything still to come. In the Force, if you knew where to look and what you were looking for, you could feel something. A thread of darkness running through the centuries, unbroken, passed from hand to hand, like a flame carried through a very long corridor in a very dark building. It never went out. It was never found. It strengthened in ways that were invisible from outside it, and it waited in the specific patient way that the Rule of Two's design demanded, for the moment when the accumulated inheritance of 1,000 years of hidden preparation could be brought to bear on a galaxy that had spent those 1,000 years forgetting that darkness, this patient, could exist. And in the outer rim, on a desert world far from the centers of power and attention, a being who called himself Darth Sidious was teaching an apprentice while cultivating influence in the Senate under another name entirely, while building toward a culmination that the Rule of Two had been designed from its very first generation to make possible. This is the story of the Old Republic, a civilization that lasted tens of thousands of years, that weathered the Rakata and the Force Wars and the Great Hyperspace War and the Great Sith War and the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War and the Dark Wars and the Great Galactic War and the New Sith Wars, that built institutions capable of surviving catastrophes that should have ended it, that produced heroes remarkable enough to face each darkness as it came and, each time, to survive the meeting, sometimes barely, sometimes at terrible cost. But always, that failed. Ultimately, not to any of the great dramatic threats it had faced and overcome, but to the slow and patient work of two people, and then two more, and then two more, passing a darkness down through the generations until the moment was finally right. The Old Republic ended the way most great things end. Not with a single decisive catastrophe visible in advance, but with the accumulated weight of 1,000 smaller choices, 1,000 moments where confidence in the institutions outran the wisdom the institutions actually possessed, until the thing that had endured for so long finally reached the limit of what even it could endure. It had lasted longer than most of its citizens could comprehend. The span of history from the Jedi on Tython to the fall of the Republic was so vast that even the beings who studied it most carefully could only hold pieces of it in mind at once. Empires had risen and fallen within it. Technologies had transformed and transformed again. Species had evolved. Stars had moved. And through all of it, the Republic had held imperfectly, stubbornly, producing generation after generation of people willing to defend it, despite its flaws, because they understood, at some level, that the alternative was what the Rakata had offered, which was not an alternative at all, but simply domination, wearing a different name. What came after is another story. The story of an empire built on a betrayal that had been prepared for 1,000 years. Of a rebellion that grew from the wreckage of everything the Old Republic had been. Of a father and a son, and a choice made at the last possible moment that changed everything. of the light that persists beyond every darkness that tries to extinguish it. But that story only exists because the Old Republic created the conditions for it, because the Jedi Order that the survivors carried into the galaxy's darkest hour had been shaped by everything that happened here, by the Jedi on Tython and the Force Wars that ended them, by the Republic that was built from the Rakata's ashes, by the Great Hyperspace War, and the Great Sith War, and the Mandalorian Wars, and all the rest of it, by the heroes and the villains and the ordinary beings caught between them, whose names history did not record, but whose lives were the substance of everything. The galaxy was old before anyone thought to write its history, and the history, when written, was longer and stranger and more full of both darkness and light than even the oldest of the beings who lived within it had fully understood. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the known, the Force continues, moving through everything, connecting everything, patient as it has always been, beyond the patience of any being that lives within it. And the story is not finished.